Hey guys, tonight we're diving headfirst into the glorious, often unromantic, world of medieval peasant love. Forget your rose-tinted glasses. We're talking mud, calloused hands, and the subtle dance of attraction when your entire life revolves around survival. Imagine the faint, earthy scent of damp straw, the distant bleating of sheep, and the rhythmic creak of a hand loom as you settle in. You're not just listening. You're here, bundled in homespun, feeling the chill of a wattle-and-daub hut seeping into your bones. It's a world where a good harvest was more exciting than a love sonnet. And frankly, you probably wouldn't survive a week. The sheer grit required just to exist, let alone find romance, was something else entirely. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're a peasant, living somewhere in the sprawling, often muddy, countryside of medieval Europe. Your days are dictated by the sun and the seasons, a relentless cycle of tilling, sowing, and reaping. You rise before dawn, roused by the distant crow of a rooster or the grumbling of an empty stomach. Your home is likely a small, single-room dwelling shared with your entire family, and probably a few chickens or a pig if you're lucky. The air is thick with the scent of wood smoke from the central hearth, which provides both warmth and the means to cook your meager meals of pottage and coarse bread. There are no fancy alarm clocks here, no espresso machines to jumpstart your day, just the raw, undeniable urge to survive. Your world extends, at most, a few miles from your village. The nearest town is a bustling metropolis of perhaps a few hundred souls, visited only on market days, if at all. For you, the horizon is defined by the tree lean, the meandering river, or the next lord's manor. Every landmark is known, every path trodden countless times. Life is physical, demanding. Your muscles ache by midday from hauling water, digging ditches, or swinging a scythe. You work alongside your family, your neighbors, a tight-knit community bound by shared labor and shared hardship. There's no escaping the watchful eyes of others. Privacy is a luxury unknown. Imagine trying to sneak a meaningful glance at someone when your entire village is perpetually within earshot. Yet, amidst this unrelenting toil, there were moments of respite, slivers of joy. The occasional feast day, a successful harvest, or the quiet satisfaction of a well-tended garden. Children played simple games, chasing chickens or rolling hoops, their laughter a fleeting counterpoint to the drone of adult labor. For you, the future wasn't some grand abstract concept. It was next season's crop, the health of your livestock, the prospect of enough food to last through the winter. Dreams, if you had them, were practical ones: a sturdy roof, a healthy child, perhaps a new pair of shoes that didn't let in the damp. A truly quirky tidbit here is that many medieval peasants believed that carrying a dried mole's foot in your pocket would ward off toothaches. Quite the dental plan, wouldn't you say? The social structure is rigid, unyielding. You are a serf, bound to the land and to your lord. You owe him labor, rent, and loyalty. Your life, in many ways, is not your own. Your choices are few, and love, if it entered the equation at all, had to fit within these predefined boundaries. There was no running off to Gretna Green for these folks. Marriage was less about grand romantic gestures and more about practical alliances, ensuring labor for the farm and continuity for the family line. It was an economic unit more than a love nest. Historians still argue whether the concept of romantic love, as we understand it today, even existed among the peasantry, or if it was solely a construct of the aristocratic courts. Whatever the truth, love certainly looked very different through the eyes of someone whose biggest daily concern was simply not starving. As you trudge through your day, whether it's mending fences or spinning flax, the pervasive presence of the local parish priest is undeniable. He's not just a spiritual guide. He's the village's moral compass, its record keeper, and often its only connection to the wider world beyond the fields. His church, usually the most imposing building in the village, is more than a place of worship. It's a community hub, a meeting point, and a stage for all of life's significant events, including the delicate dance of courtship and marriage. You probably don't have a calendar, but you know the rhythm of the church bells, marking the hours and signaling important feast days. The priest's sermon on Sunday, delivered in Latin that you mostly don't understand, but with gestures and tone that make the message clear, would often touch upon the sacred nature of marriage. He would emphasize its divine purpose, procreation, avoiding sin, and providing mutual support. These weren't exactly passionate declarations of love, were they? More like a divine checklist for a good, righteous life. He'd remind everyone that marriage was a sacrament, a holy bond, indissoluble except by death. This meant no easy exits. No, it's not working out conversations. Once you were in for the long haul, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, though mostly just poorer and sicker, let's be honest. His influence extended to regulating who could marry whom. The church had very strict rules about consanguinity, meaning you couldn't marry anyone too closely related to you. And by closely related, they meant even distant cousins you might not even know existed. They tracked these relationships meticulously, sometimes requiring special dispensations that were both hard to get and expensive. Imagine being told you couldn't marry the person down the lane because their great-aunt twice removed was somehow related to your distant uncle. It added an extra layer of complexity to an already complex decision, almost like a medieval version of a background check, but for bloodlines instead of credit scores. The priest was also the one who performed the betrothal ceremony, often a public affair, and later, the wedding itself. His blessing was essential for the union to be legitimate in the eyes of both God and the community. He mediated disputes, advised on proper conduct between spouses, and held significant sway over the community's perceptions of proper marital behavior. If a couple was seen arguing too much, or if one spouse wasn't pulling their weight, you can bet the priest would hear about it, and you'd likely get a stern talking to during confession. It was a bit like having a spiritual supervisor, constantly evaluating your domestic harmony. A fascinating, if somewhat odd, historical fact is that during this period, priests would sometimes encourage hand-fasting, a temporary, binding agreement to marry, often for a year and a day, after which it could be made permanent or dissolved. While not universally practiced and often frowned upon by later church doctrine, it offered a bit of medieval flexibility, like a trial period for marriage. Historians still argue whether these informal arrangements were truly commonplace, or if they were more exceptional cases that survived in the legal records. But for the average peasant, the priest was the gatekeeper to marriage, the keeper of morals, and the watchful eye ensuring that unions served the practical and spiritual needs of the community, not just the fleeting whims of the heart. His presence was a constant reminder that love, in this era, was very much a communal, rather than purely personal, affair. With the priest's watchful eye ever present, you'd quickly learn that when it came to marriage in your medieval village, family arrangements were practical, often brutally so, and definitely not romantic in the sense you might imagine. Forget grand proposals under a moonlit sky. Decisions about who married whom were less about butterflies in the stomach and more about oxen in the barn. For a peasant family, a marriage was primarily an economic alliance, a strategic move to secure labor, consolidate land, or even just ensure survival for the next generation. It was less about finding the one and more about finding the useful one. Imagine your parents sitting around the smoky hearth, discussing your future spouse as if you were a particularly valuable goat. They'd be weighing up the potential partner's family's land holdings. Do they have a good strip near the river? Or the number of strong sons who could help in the fields, or healthy daughters who could contribute to the household chores? It was a cold, hard assessment of assets and liabilities. There was no real concept of following your heart, when your heart literally needed to follow the plow to ensure everyone ate. A family with many mouths to feed, but little land, might seek out a match with a family who had more land but fewer hands to work it. It was medieval synergy, if you will, but with less PowerPoint and more manure. This is a mainstream historical fact. Arranged marriages were the norm across all social classes in medieval Europe. though the specifics varied. For peasants, the arrangements were often made by parents or guardians, sometimes when the future spouses were still children, though consummation wouldn't happen until they were old enough. This early agreement helped to solidify alliances between families and plan for the future. You might find yourself betrothed to someone you'd known your whole life, perhaps even played with as children, but the decision would have been made by adults based on what was best for the collective, not the individual. It's a bit like being assigned a group project partner for life, where the success of the project means everyone gets to eat. A quirky or fringe tidbit here is that sometimes, particularly in desperate times like famine, parents might even sell their children in a marriage as a way to ensure their survival, trading a child for a dowry of food or a guarantee of a secure home. While not commonplace, it speaks to the extreme pressures that dictated these decisions. Historians still argue whether these extreme cases reflect a complete lack of parental affection or a desperate act of love to save a child from starvation. Of course, this isn't to say that affection never grew between married peasants. Far from it. But the initial spark, if there was one, was rarely the primary driver. It was about creating a functional unit. Your potential spouse would be assessed for their work ethic, their physical strength, their ability to bear healthy children, and their general demeanor. Someone too quarrelsome wouldn't make for a very efficient farmhand, would they? Compatibility was certainly desired, but it was a compatibility born of shared labor and common goals, not necessarily shared interests in, say, philosophical debates or competitive turnip growing. Your date night might involve mending a roof together or sorting grain, finding connection in shared purpose rather than shared leisure. Given that your parents, and indeed the entire village, were essentially acting as matchmakers for practical purposes, how exactly did early courtship even happen? Well, it was a subtle, often excruciatingly slow dance of subtle signals and superstitions, unfolding beneath the ever-present gaze of the community. You certainly weren't going to be leaving love notes tied to pigeons or writing sonnets. Any open display of affection before a formal betrothal would be scandalous, likely leading to a stern lecture from the priest and a good telling off from your parents. Imagine, if you will, the limited opportunities. Most of your waking hours were spent working in the fields or around the house, surrounded by family. So, those fleeting moments when you might encounter someone you found interesting perhaps at the village well, or during a quick trip to the mill were charged with an almost unbearable tension. A prolonged glance, a quick smile that lingered a moment too long, a slightly flushed cheek as you accidentally brushed shoulders while stacking hay. These were the grand romantic gestures of the medieval peasant. It's like a silent movie, where every twitch of an eyebrow carries immense weight. You're practically a master of nonverbal communication, aren't you? A mainstream historical fact is that young people in medieval villages had very few private spaces. Courtship often took place in public, or at least in semi-public settings like the church porch after Mass, or during communal work where supervision was constant. This meant that reputation was everything. Any hint of impropriety could ruin a young woman's chances of a good marriage, or indeed, any marriage at all. For young men, it was about demonstrating capability and good character. So, proving your worth might involve showing off your strength during a harvest, or demonstrating your skill at carpentry, rather than, say, reciting poetry. Now for a genuinely quirky or fringe tidbit. There were numerous folk beliefs and superstitions surrounding love and marriage. Young women might secretly try to divine their future husband's identity using rituals involving apples, mirrors, or even hemp seeds scattered at midnight in a churchyard. For example, some believe that if you ate an apple while looking into a mirror on Halloween, you might catch a glimpse of your future spouse's reflection behind you. It sounds like a scene from a low-budget horror film, but for them, it was serious business, a desperate attempt to gain some control or insight into a future that felt largely predetermined. Historians still argue whether these practices were merely innocent games or if they truly reflected a deep-seated anxiety about the uncertainties of marital prospects in such a rigid society. You might also see slightly bolder, yet still innocent acts. A young man might offer to help a young woman with a particularly heavy task or share a piece of bread during a break. These small acts of kindness, almost imperceptible to an outsider, could be interpreted as signs of interest. The dating app of the medieval peasant was essentially just existing in the same physical space and subtly demonstrating that you weren't a complete oaf. And let's be honest, in a world where everyone knows everyone's business, a little bit of mystery and subtle flirting probably went a long way to making life a bit more interesting. While daily life offered only fleeting, subtle opportunities for romantic gestures, the medieval calendar did provide specific, designated moments when the social fabric loosened just enough for more overt interactions. Festivals and feasts. These were the medieval equivalent of our modern-day social mixers. Except instead of lukewarm punch and awkward small talk, you got ale, roasted meats, and probably a lot of communal singing. These gatherings, often tied to religious holidays or the changing agricultural seasons, were a much anticipated break from the relentless grind. You'd mark them on your mental calendar, anticipating the chance to see and be seen. A mainstream historical fact is that these communal events were vital for social cohesion and provided the primary setting for widespread interaction outside of work. Think of May Day celebrations, harvest festivals, or Saints' Days days where labor ceased, and the entire village, sometimes even people from neighboring hamlets, would come together. This meant more people, more noise, and crucially, more freedom to move and interact. You might find yourself dancing in a circle, your hand brushing against someone else's, or sharing a communal cup of ale, catching their eye across the smoky fire. These weren't quiet, intimate moments. They were boisterous, public displays, and your private hopes had to navigate the crowd. The atmosphere was less about one-on-one dates and more about group dynamics. Young men would often demonstrate their strength and prowess in games or contests, hoping to impress. Imagine a wrestling match or a competitive tug-of-war, where a strong performance might earn admiring glances from the village maidens. It was all about showing off your practical value. Look at me, I can lift that heavy log. Imagine what I could do with a plow. And for the young women, it was a chance to display their domestic skills, perhaps through the food they brought, or simply to show their good humor and social grace. It was a bit like a medieval talent show, where the prizes weren't trophies, but potential spouses. Here's a quirky or fringe tidbit. During some festivals, like certain fertility rites in spring, traditional customs might even involve a degree of playful pairing up or symbolic unions, though these were generally understood to be temporary and for merriment, not serious betrothal. It was a chance to flirt without the usual intense scrutiny, almost like a temporary suspension of the strict rules. Think of it as a medieval speed dating event, but with more folk dancing and fewer awkward silences. Historians still argue whether these temporary pairings ever led to actual, more serious courtships, or if they were purely ritualistic and symbolic. Despite the public nature, individual glances and conversations could still hold immense significance. A brief shared laugh over a clumsy dancer, a moment of eye contact across the village green, these were the sparks that could ignite quiet interest. It was during these festivals that you might get a clearer sense of who was available, who was being eyed by others, and perhaps who might return your subtle glances. While family arrangements were paramount, these festivals offered a crucial space for organic attraction to develop, however cautiously, and for young peasants to observe each other's character outside of the relentless demands of daily labor. It was a time when the weight of expectation lifted just a little, allowing for a glimpse of personality beyond the work-worn exterior. Once those subtle signals had been exchanged, and perhaps a flicker of mutual interest caught the eye of the respective families, the next crucial step in your medieval peasant love story was betrothal, a serious, binding commitment. This wasn't some casual, going steady arrangement you might know from your own youth. In the eyes of the church and the community, a betrothal was almost as weighty as the marriage itself, often carrying significant legal and social implications long before any wedding bells chimed. You'd feel the shift in the air, a certain gravity settling over the situation. A mainstream historical fact is that betrothal, or sponsalia, was a formal public ceremony, often held in the church porch or at the home of one of the parties. It involved the exchange of vows or promises to marry in the future, witnessed by family and community members. This wasn't a secret handshake. It was an open declaration of intent. Sometimes a ring was exchanged, or a simple gift solidifying the verbal agreement. This commitment was considered so strong that, in some interpretations, breaking a betrothal was akin to breaking a marriage vow, incurring social shame and potential legal penalties. Imagine promising to marry someone and then realizing you preferred someone else in your time. Maybe a bit awkward, and there's potentially ruinous. This period between betrothal and marriage could last for months or even years, especially if the couple was young. It allowed time for the families to prepare, to gather resources for the new household, and for the young man to demonstrate his ability to provide. It also, crucially, allowed the couple to get to know each other under the watchful eye of the community, albeit within strict boundaries. There was no dating in the modern sense. You were essentially engaged and expected to act like it. It was like a very, very long engagement party where everyone was scrutinizing your every move. Now, for a slightly quirky or fringe tidbit, there's evidence, particularly in later medieval periods, of hand-fasting rituals, as we touched on earlier, which were sometimes a form of informal, temporary betrothal where a couple might live together for a year and a day before deciding to formalize the marriage. While the church increasingly frowned upon these unblessed unions, they highlight a tension between strict ecclesiastical law and local custom. It shows a desire for flexibility in an otherwise rigid system. Though whether your particular village would countenance such a thing would depend entirely on local traditions and the sternness of your priest. Historians still argue whether the church's attempts to standardize marriage practices fully eradicated these more informal betrothal customs among the peasantry. The weight of this commitment was immense. You were not just promising yourself to another person. You were promising your labor, your future children, and your very life into a shared existence aimed at survival and continuation of the family line. The social pressure to uphold the betrothal was enormous. A broken promise could damage the reputation of both families, making it difficult for other siblings to find good matches. So, while the initial decision might have been pragmatic, the act of betrothal itself carried a profound personal and communal significance, binding you to a future that, for better or worse, was now largely set. With the betrothal firmly established, your future was taking shape, but it wasn't just about promises and public declarations. A fundamental, often overlooked aspect of any medieval peasant union involved dowries and dower, the economic realities of union. These weren't merely optional gifts. They were crucial financial exchanges that underscored the very foundation of the marriage, making it less of a fairy tale and more of a business merger. You quickly understood that even love, if it existed, had to be financially viable. A mainstream historical fact is that the concept of a dowry was prevalent across medieval society, though its form varied significantly depending on social class and region. For peasants, a dowry, from the bride's family to the groom or his family, rarely consisted of gold or silver, which were scarce. Instead, it was typically practical goods essential for setting up a new household or enhancing the existing farm. Imagine a small cow, a few chickens, a bolt of linen, a cooking pot, or perhaps a portion of land or rights to its use. It was a transfer of resources to help the new couple establish their economic unit. It sounds a bit like bringing your own appliances to the marriage, doesn't it? Here's my dowry, darling. One slightly used churn and a very enthusiastic goose. Conversely, the groom's family was often expected to provide a dower, sometimes called a morning gift if given after the wedding night, or a marriage portion, which was a provision for the bride in case of her husband's death. This was usually land or goods designated for her support as a widow. It was a crucial form of security, ensuring that she wouldn't be left destitute if her husband died young, a sadly common occurrence in those times. It was the medieval equivalent of a life insurance policy, but instead of monthly premiums, it was agreed upon at the time of marriage. Here's a quirky or fringe tidbit. The specific items included in a peasant dowry could sometimes be incredibly detailed and prescriptive, even down to the number of spoons or the quality of the bedding. Some customary laws or manorial records might list expected dowry items for different social tiers of peasants. This wasn't just about what was brought. It was about demonstrating the family's standing and their commitment to the new union. It's like a medieval bridal registry, but instead of blenders, it's livestock. Historians still argue whether the dowry represented a woman's share of her family's inheritance or was primarily a payment to the groom's family for taking her on. These economic considerations often trumped personal preference. A match that offered a good dowry or secured valuable dower rights was almost always preferred over one that lacked such benefits, regardless of any burgeoning affection between the young couple. Your family would scrutinize the offerings from the prospective spouse's family with the intensity of modern-day investors poring over stock reports. After all, the survival of both families depended on these pragmatic alliances. So, while you might dream of a strapping young man with kind eyes, your parents were more concerned with his oxen and his family's reputation for never missing a harvest. It truly was a foundational element, ensuring that the union was viable in the harsh economic reality of medieval life. After the careful negotiations of dowry and dower, and the solemn public declaration of betrothal, the moment finally arrived for the wedding customs. Simple rituals, deep meaning. You wouldn't find elaborate gowns or tiered cakes in your medieval peasant wedding. These ceremonies were often humble, reflecting the realities of village life. Yet they were imbued with profound significance, marking a complete shift in your social and economic standing. A mainstream historical fact is that peasant weddings were generally simple affairs, often taking place at the church door or even outside in the village, before processing into the church for a blessing. The focus was less on spectacle and more on the community's witnessing and affirmation of a union. Imagine the whole village gathered, dressed in their best, which wasn't saying much, but still, watching as you stood with your betrothed. The priest would perform a blessing, perhaps hear your vows, and sprinkle holy water. The exchange of rings was common, symbolizing eternity and fidelity. These were often simple bands, perhaps made from iron, signifying the strength and endurance required of the marriage. No diamond solitaires in sight, unless it was a particularly shiny pebble. The act of joining hands, hand fasting in its more formal sense, even though the term sometimes referred to temporary betrothals, was a crucial part of the ceremony, symbolizing the binding together of two individuals and two families. After the church blessing, the celebrations would move to a communal feast, likely held outdoors or in the largest barn available. This was where the practical joys came in: food, ale, music, and dancing. It was a chance for everyone to relax and celebrate, an important release from the daily grind. It's safe to say there were no fancy caterers. Everyone brought what they could contribute, making it a true potluck celebration. Here's a quirky or fringe tidbit. A common medieval wedding custom was the bedding of the bride, where the newly married couple was formally escorted to their marriage bed by members of the community, sometimes even blessed by the priest. While this might sound rather intrusive to modern ears, it served as a public affirmation of the marriage's consummation and legitimacy, and was less about voyeurism and more about ensuring the union was complete and capable of producing heirs. Historians still argue whether this practice was a sign of the community's overwhelming control over private lives or a protective measure to ensure the bride's marital rights and the legitimacy of future children. The gifts exchanged were practical: tools, livestock, household goods, items that would directly contribute to the new couple's ability to run their home and farm. The focus was entirely on establishing a functional, productive unit. There were no elaborate honeymoon plans, no romantic getaways. Your honeymoon would involve waking up the next day and getting straight back to work, but now with a partner by your side, sharing the burden and the hope for a prosperous future. These simple rituals, performed under the watchful eyes of the village and the blessing of the church, solidified a bond that was intended to last a lifetime. forging a new economic and social entity within the community. With the wedding feast over and the last notes of the lute fading into the night, you awaken to your new reality: marital life, labor, children, and shared burdens. This was the true core of a medieval peasant marriage, a partnership forged in the fires of necessity. There were no romantic breakfasts in bed, unless breakfast in bed meant gnawing on a stale crust while your spouse stirred the pottage over the hearth. Your daily existence now was a continuous, often grueling, collaboration. A mainstream historical fact is that the division of labor in a peasant household was generally distinct but flexible. Men typically handled the heavier fieldwork, plowing, sowing, harvesting, and caring for larger livestock. Women managed the household, which was a monumental task in itself. Cooking, cleaning, spinning, weaving, making clothes, tending the garden, caring for chickens and small animals, and of course, bearing and raising children. Yet, these roles weren't rigid. During harvest season, everyone, including children, worked in the fields. A wife might help her husband with certain farm tasks, and a husband might assist with household repairs. It was all hands on deck all the time. Think of it as a small, incredibly busy, family-run business, where everyone's job description included everything necessary to avoid starvation. Children were not just a blessing. They were an absolute necessity. They represented future labor for the farm and security for your old age, which, let's be honest, probably wasn't going to be very long. Infant mortality was tragically high, so having many children was a way to ensure some would survive to adulthood. This constant cycle of childbearing and child-rearing added another immense layer of labor, particularly for the wife. While there was undoubtedly affection for their offspring, children were fundamentally seen as economic assets, vital to the continuation of the family unit and the farm. Imagine trying to run a farm, manage a household, and raise a brood of children without any modern conveniences, no running water, no electricity, just sheer physical effort. It makes your average Monday morning look like a spa day. Here's a quirky or fringe tidbit. Despite the hard work, peasant households often had simple entertainments. Storytelling, riddles, and singing were common evening pastimes, often shared around the flickering light of the hearth. Sometimes neighbors would visit, sharing news and gossip. These small moments of communal joy provided crucial respite and fostered bonds not just between spouses, but within the extended family and community. It was the medieval version of Netflix and chill, but with more communal storytelling and fewer screens. Historians still argue about the extent to which these evenings were truly leisure, or simply another form of social bonding necessary for group survival. The success of your marriage was directly tied to your ability to work together. A lazy spouse, a quarrelsome spouse, or one who didn't pull their weight could threaten the survival of the entire family. It was a partnership of endurance, where shared hardship and mutual reliance formed the bedrock of the relationship. Love, in this context, wasn't about grand romantic gestures, but about the quiet, consistent acts of support, sharing the last piece of bread, mending a torn tunic, or simply enduring another long winter side by side. It was a love born of shared burdens, a deep, practical bond that sustained life itself. So, with all that talk of shared labor, economic units, and sheer survival, you might be wondering, did love and affection, a quiet, evolving bond, even exist for medieval peasants? The answer, despite the pragmatic origins of marriage, is almost certainly yes, but it was a different kind of love than the passionate, whirlwind romance you see in movies today. It was a bond that grew slowly, almost imperceptibly, forged in the crucible of daily life. A mainstream historical fact is that while romantic love, as an ideal, might have been more prevalent in courtly literature among the nobility, affection and deep bonds certainly developed between peasant spouses. After all, you were sharing everything: your home, your work, your worries, and your meager joys. Imagine countless hours spent side by side in the fields, the quiet understanding that passes between two people engaged in the same tiring task, or the unspoken comfort of a shared meal after a long, cold day. These were the moments where affection could take root, evolving into a quiet, enduring partnership. It wasn't about grand declarations. It was about steady, reliable presence. Think of the small gestures that would signify affection. Perhaps your spouse would save the warmest spot by the fire for you, or share a particularly ripe berry picked from a bush during fieldwork. It might be the husband taking a moment to mend his wife's broken tool, or the wife ensuring her husband's tunic was always patched and clean. These weren't dramatic acts, but they were acts of care and mutual support that, over years, would deepen into a profound connection. It was less about fireworks and more about a warm, steady glow, like the embers of your hearth, constantly tended and never allowed to die out. Here's a quirky or fringe tidbit. Despite the general illiteracy, some simple forms of folk poetry or songs existed among the peasantry, occasionally hinting at personal affections, though often more broadly celebrating fertility, the seasons, or communal life. These weren't elaborate sonnets, but perhaps a simple verse sung around the fire, expressing appreciation for a hardworking spouse or the joys of a healthy family. It's not exactly hitting the top of the charts, but it's a genuine expression, isn't it? Historians still argue whether these oral traditions truly reflected personal romantic feelings or were merely cultural expressions of societal ideals about marriage and family. Moreover, the act of raising children together, mourning losses, and celebrating small triumphs would inevitably draw two people closer. When disease swept through the village, or famine threatened, you depended on your spouse more than anyone. That shared vulnerability, the experience of weathering life's storms as a unit, would undoubtedly foster a powerful bond of loyalty and affection. It wasn't the kind of love that swept you off your feet, but the kind that helped you keep your feet firmly planted on the ground, even when the ground itself felt unstable. It was a love that understood the rhythm of the seasons, the harshness of the land, and the quiet strength found in enduring together. Even for the most steadfast peasant couple, the quiet bond of affection and partnership was constantly threatened by external forces. Your marital journey, no matter how strong, was always shadowed by the ever-present specters of challenges to union: disease, famine, war. These were not abstract concepts. They were terrifying realities that could shatter a family unit in an instant, often with little to no warning. A mainstream historical fact is that life expectancy in the Middle Ages was shockingly low, and peasants were particularly vulnerable. Disease was rampant. Without sanitation, basic hygiene, or medical knowledge, even a simple infection could be deadly. The Black Death, for instance, wiped out an estimated 1/3 to half of Europe's population in the mid-14th century. Imagine the terror of watching a spouse, a child, or an entire family succumb to an illness that no one understood, with no doctor to call, no medicine to administer. These epidemics tore through villages, leaving behind a trail of grief and broken families. The quiet understanding between you and your partner could be abruptly severed by a sudden fever. Then there was famine. You lived on the knife edge of survival, your very existence tied to the success of the harvest. A poor growing season, a prolonged drought, or excessive rains could mean crop failure, leading to widespread starvation. You might have carefully stored grain, but if the famine stretched on, even that would run out. Husbands and wives would watch helplessly as their children wasted away, or as their own strength failed. This wasn't just about hunger. It was about the profound psychological toll of scarcity, the desperate search for food, and the heartbreaking realization that there simply wasn't enough to go around. It could force impossible choices, and the strain on a marriage, even a strong one, would have been immense. It's safe to say date night didn't involve a tasting menu. Here's a quirky or fringe tidbit. During periods of extreme famine, desperation could lead to unsettling practices. In some accounts, peasants were forced to eat whatever they could find: tree bark, roots, even clay. This speaks to the utter desolation that famine brought, forcing people to abandon conventional morality simply to survive. Historians still argue about the true prevalence of these extreme measures and the extent to which they fractured communal bonds versus reinforcing the need for mutual support. And then there was war. While grand battles might have involved knights and lords, their conflicts often spilled into the countryside, devastating peasant communities. Armies, both friendly and enemy, would march through your lands, foraging for supplies, trampling crops, and sometimes destroying entire villages. You could lose your home, your livelihood, or even your life in a conflict that had nothing to do with you personally. A husband might be conscripted into a lord's levy, leaving his wife to manage the farm alone, with no guarantee of his return. Or a wife and children might be forced to flee, becoming refugees in their own land. These external shocks were constant, unpredictable, and profoundly destabilizing to the fragile structure of a peasant family and the relationship within it. A sudden raid could mean the loss of everything you had built with your spouse, a brutal reminder that your lives were always at the mercy of forces far beyond your control. When the relentless pressures of medieval life became too much, or when human nature simply took its course, what happened when a peasant marriage began to fray? The concepts of infidelity and divorce, rare, drastic measures, were profoundly different from our modern understanding. For a medieval peasant, escaping a marriage or straying from it carried immense social stigma and severe repercussions. You lived in a world where your reputation and that of your family was everything. A mainstream historical fact is that formal divorce, as we understand it today, the legal dissolution of a marriage, was virtually non-existent for peasants in medieval Europe. The church considered marriage a sacrament, a lifelong bond that could only be broken by death. Annulments were possible, but these were rare, complex, and usually only granted to the wealthy and powerful, and they typically involved proving the marriage was never valid in the first place, e.g., due to close kinship or lack of consent. For you, a peasant, if you married, you were married for good. It was a commitment with no exit clause, no easy way out of an unhappy union, and definitely no conscious uncoupling. Infidelity, however, was a different matter. While divorce was almost impossible, extramarital affairs certainly occurred, because human nature, well, it's remarkably consistent across the centuries, isn't it? But the consequences for a peasant were severe. For a woman, adultery was considered a grave sin and a serious social transgression. It could lead to public shaming, ostracization from the community, and even physical punishment, sometimes at the hands of her husband or the Lord's representative. Her reputation would be ruined, making her an outcast and potentially affecting the legitimacy and inheritance of her children. For a man, the consequences might be less severe legally, but he too would face social disapproval and potential fines from the Lord or the church. Imagine trying to explain that to your priest during confession. Here's a quirky or fringe tidbit. In some local manorial courts, minor domestic disputes, including accusations of infidelity or excessive quarreling, could be brought before the Lord or his representative. The punishments could be quite public and humiliating, designed to restore order and shame the transgressor. This might involve standing in the stocks, paying a small fine, or even being forced to make a public apology. It was a localized form of justice aimed at maintaining communal harmony, and everyone would know your business faster than any medieval rumor mill could churn. Historians still argue whether these public shaming rituals truly deterred infidelity or merely served as a means for lords to exert control over their serfs' personal lives. So, while the idea of a bad marriage existed, the options for dealing with it were incredibly limited. Most couples simply had to endure, finding ways to make their partnership work, perhaps cultivating that quiet, evolving bond we discussed earlier, or simply living with the practical necessities. The social pressure to conform, to maintain appearances, and to continue the essential labor of the farm would have been immense. In a world where your entire survival depended on community and conformity, the idea of stepping outside the strict marital boundaries was a truly drastic and often perilous choice. Life in the medieval village, as you've undoubtedly gathered, was relentlessly harsh, And even the strongest marital bonds could be severed not by choice, but by the relentless hand of fate. This brings us to widowhood and remarriage, necessity and opportunity. For peasants, the death of a spouse, while undoubtedly painful, often presented an immediate, pragmatic dilemma that transcended grief. Survival often dictated the next steps. A mainstream historical fact is that given the low life expectancy and the physically demanding nature of peasant life, widowhood was a common occurrence, particularly for women who often outlived their husbands. For a peasant woman, losing her husband meant losing the primary male labor force for the farm, the one who typically handled the heaviest plowing, sowing, and harvesting. Suddenly, she was left with children, land that needed tending, and no strong arms to do it. For a peasant man, losing his wife meant losing the household manager, the one who cooked, cleaned, spun, wove, and cared for the children. Both scenarios presented immediate and severe challenges to the viability of the household. It wasn't just emotional loss, it was an economic crisis. Because the survival of the farm and family depended on a complete, functional unit, remarriage was often a necessity, not just an option. A widow might remarry quickly to ensure the farm continued to operate and her children were provided for. A widower might seek a new wife to manage his home and raise his children. These subsequent marriages, even more so than first marriages, were driven almost entirely by practical considerations. You might see a woman marrying a man significantly older or younger than herself, or a man taking on a widow with several children, all because the practical benefits outweighed any personal preference. It was a utilitarian approach to building a family, like finding the missing piece to a very vital puzzle. Here's a quirky or fringe tidbit. In some manorial customs, a widow might retain certain rights to her deceased husband's land or property as her dower, but these rights could sometimes be conditional on her remaining chaste or not remarrying outside the manor. However, often, the Lord would actively encourage or even pressure a widow to remarry quickly, precisely to ensure the land continued to be worked and the Lord's rents were paid. It was less about your emotional well-being and more about maintaining the agricultural output. Historians still argue whether such customs were primarily about economic control or also served a social function by integrating widows back into productive family units. So, while grief was real, the practical imperative to remarry often superseded prolonged mourning. There was little time for introspection or a long period of single life. The land needed tending, the children needed raising, and the household needed managing. Remarriage was a testament to the resilience of the medieval peasant, an almost immediate response to a profound loss, driven by the absolute necessity of keeping the family unit, and indeed the entire village, afloat. It was a stark reminder that in this era, personal desires often took a back seat to the demands of survival. Having traversed the muddy fields and humble homes of medieval peasants, enduring their daily grind, their quiet courtships, and their practical marriages, you're left with a profound appreciation for the peasant legacy, endurance, and resilience. These were not the grand figures of history, the kings and queens, knights and scholars, whose lives filled illuminated manuscripts. Yet, their story, the story of the vast majority of people living in the Middle Ages, is one of unwavering strength in the face of unimaginable hardship. A mainstream historical fact is that despite the constant threats of famine, disease, and war, the peasant population not only persisted but eventually grew, laying the foundational workforce for the burgeoning towns and eventually the very economies that would lead to the modern world. Their enduring labor on the land sustained society. They were the silent backbone of an entire era, feeding everyone from the lowliest beggar to the highest lord. Imagine planting crops year after year, knowing that a single bad season could mean starvation, yet still sowing those seeds with hope. That's not just work, that's an act of faith, isn't it? Their lives were not about grand achievements or individual fame. Their legacy lies in the continuation of generations, in the quiet transfer of knowledge from parent to child about how to work the land, how to mend a tool, how to survive another winter. It was a communal legacy built on shared experience and mutual support. They understood, perhaps better than anyone, that individual survival was inextricably linked to the well-being of the collective. When you remember that crocodile dung sunscreen we mentioned earlier, or the desperate measures during famine, it truly highlights their inventive and often gritty determination to keep going. Here's a quirky or fringe tidbit. Despite their perceived simplicity, medieval peasants had a rich oral culture of folk tales, proverbs, and songs, often imbued with practical wisdom, humor, and sometimes subtle critiques of authority. These weren't written down in fancy books, but passed from mouth to ear, often around the very hearths you imagined earlier. These stories and sayings were a way of making sense of their world, preserving traditions, and finding joy in the midst of adversity. Historians still argue about the extent to which these oral traditions allowed peasants to express dissent or merely reinforced existing social hierarchies. The resilience of the medieval peasant was not a dramatic, heroic charge into battle, but a quiet, day-by-day persistence. It was in the mending of a threadbare tunic for the 100th time, in the careful tending of a sick animal, in the shared laughter over a simple meal. It was in the decision, every single morning, to get up and face another day of relentless labor, knowing that their efforts directly contributed to the survival of their family and their community. They were the embodiment of human tenacity, living lives that were often short, brutish, and poor, yet finding ways to love, to connect, and to leave behind a heritage of sheer, unyielding endurance. They remind us that true strength often lies not in power or wealth, but in the unwavering spirit of the everyday. As we gently pull away from the dim, smoky hearths and muddy lanes of the medieval world, it's worth considering how this ancient quest for connection resonates with our own. After all, the fundamental human desire for partnership, for someone to share life's burdens and joys, remains universal. This is where we connect to modern echoes, love's universal, enduring quest. A mainstream historical fact is that while the external circumstances of love and marriage have transformed dramatically, the underlying human need for companionship, intimacy, and belonging has remained constant across millennia. You might have dating apps, romantic comedies, and countless options, but the core drive to find a partner, to build a life with someone, is the same yearning that stirred within a medieval peasant standing awkwardly at the village well. The tools and traditions change, but the impulse endures. They sought a steady hand to work the land. We seek a steady hand to navigate the complexities of modern life. Consider how much more personal love has become. For medieval peasants, marriage was largely a communal and economic affair, dictated by family survival. For us, it's an intensely individual journey, focused on personal fulfillment, shared values, and emotional connection. We spend years, sometimes decades, searching for the one, fueled by ideals of passionate romance and deep compatibility. They hope for a good worker and a healthy progeny. We hope for a soulmate and someone to binge-watch shows with. It's a different kind of burden, perhaps, but a burden nonetheless. Here's a quirky or fringe tidbit. Some modern anthropologists and sociologists suggest that the very concept of romantic love leading to marriage is a relatively recent historical invention, only gaining widespread cultural dominance in the last few centuries. Before that, marriages were largely about practical arrangements, much like those of our medieval peasants. It makes you wonder, doesn't it, if our current obsession with finding a single, perfect person for all our emotional needs might be just another passing cultural phase like bell-bottoms or crocodile dung sunscreen. Historians still argue about the true origins and evolution of romantic love as a societal ideal, and whether it truly supplanted older, more pragmatic views of marriage or simply added a new layer. Ultimately, the story of how medieval peasants fell in love and lost it isn't just a historical footnote. It's a powerful reminder of human adaptability and the enduring nature of our needs. They found connection amidst hardship, built families despite overwhelming odds, and discovered affection in the quiet moments between monumental tasks. Their love wasn't grand or theatrical. It was resilient, rooted in shared purpose and the simple, profound act of enduring together. As you drift off tonight, perhaps you can appreciate the quiet strength of those forgotten figures, their lives tethered to the rhythm of the earth, their hearts finding connection in the most unassuming ways. Their story, in its own silent way, whispers a timeless truth. Love, in all its forms, is an unbreakable thread that weaves through the tapestry of human existence, enduring across centuries, cultures, and conditions. And now, as the last echoes of the medieval village fade into the distance, feel the quiet settling around you. The distant sounds of the field, the chatter of the market, the solemn blessing of the priest, they're all becoming softer, gentler. Imagine the rustle of leaves outside your window, or the steady, rhythmic hum of your fan, carrying you further into comfort. Your mind is calm, clear, unburdened by the worries of the day or the long-forgotten challenges of a peasant's life. Let the stillness embrace you, a soft blanket of peace wrapping around your thoughts. There's nothing more to do now, nowhere more to go. Just surrender to the quiet, to the gentle drift. Let your breath deepen, your body relax, and your mind finally release its hold.